Hello, and welcome virtually to the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Hopkins Center for Canadian Studies. And today's event is being co-sponsored by the China Research Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS, directed by my faculty colleague, Andrew Murtha. Andrew Murtha, unfortunately, is stuck on a plane, and so I'm going solo, but I know that he'll be watching this event later, and I want to thank him for his support. Our research centers on Canada and China wanted to collaborate to bring today's event on this book, The Two Michaels, Innocent Canadian Captives and High-Stakes Espionage in the U.S. China Cyber War. The authors of this book are with us today to talk about one of the early episodes in U.S. China rivalry in the current phase. Some call it a new Cold War. And what can we learn from how this particular incident, now complete, has played out between the United States and Canada, between Canada and China, and of course, between the United States and China. Our first author who will speak is Mike Blanchfield, who is the international affairs writer for the Canadian Press based in Ottawa. Mike has been a journalist on Parliament Hill since 1998. I feel like I've known him almost that long, and his reporting has taken him around the world, including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He has worked at the Ottawa Citizen for 22 years prior to 2009 and in taking on the role with the Canadian Press. One of Canada's finest journalists, and I'm really glad we have you here today, Mike. Also with us, Fen Hampson, who is the Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University and a President of the World Refugee and Migration Council. He was a distinguished fellow and director for global security research at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And I knew him when I had the chance on a Fulbright to be with him at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, where he was one of the most distinguished directors that institution has had. Mike, Fen, thank you for being here. Let me turn over to you, Mike, first, just to open us up and tell us why you wrote the book and why this incident, in your mind, is so important for people to understand.
Well, thank you for the kind welcome, Chris, and it's great to see you again. It's been, I guess, starting point is, I guess, maybe most relevant for your audience here is why does this book matter to Americans, an American audience? And I think the simple answer to that is the story starts with a United States request to Canada to extradite Meng Wanzhou to face fraud charges in the United States. It was a very unusual way to go after a company, and it for legal reasons, and it was indicative of sort of an unorthodox approach of pursuing American sort of foreign policy interest under a president that obviously threw out the playbook on a lot of things. And anyway, so Canada, and this is how Canada was positioned in this, it was part of this ongoing rivalry between China and the United States. At the moment this was happening, there was obviously the trade wars between the Trump administration and Xi Jinping. But for a decade before that, there was a concerted effort by U.S. governments on both sides of the aisle to do something about the rise of a company named Huawei and just the technological reach of China into the internet space of Western democracies of the world, and that became sort of the backdrop of this book, and I think that's why it remains relative to an American audience today as we see the events playing out in Ukraine and Russia. Basically, it was an episode where we saw the one of the first salvos of sort of the international rules-based order, the playbook, just being thrown out by other players. I think it was a dynamic we saw happening throughout this 3-year ordeal of these two Michaels in prison in China and the various efforts to get them out. And Canada at the start of this basically found itself alone on the world stage in terms of having friends and allies. things weren't going along well with the Trump administration, and everything was all about getting a new North American free trade deal done. This happened in the middle of that. The United States was trying to get some kind of trade deal with China, and the Trump administration was bargaining very hard. And at one point, very early on, it was clear that these two Canadians and this Chinese executive, who eventually got out on bail and got to live in a very nice mansion in the beautiful city of Vancouver, were obviously pawns in all of this. So ultimately, this this matter was resolved through, I guess, rewriting the playbook a bit, but also going back to some old time honored, approaches in the Cold War, swapping prisoners, which is what it turned out, which is literally how this episode got resolved. But the twists and turns along the way raise a lot of issues about obviously human rights, the future of the internet, and just whether or not this so-called concept of the rule of law that people kept gravitating towards, how strong was it, how malleable was it, how adaptable was it, perhaps to people and players on the globe who don't really play by any kind of playbook that can be divined, or maybe a book that we haven't read yet.
Thanks very much, Mike. Fen, what brought you to tell this story in this book and at this time?
Well, I think I can say, like you, I've known Mike Blanchfield a long time, and I knew some of the former Canadian politicians and others who were trying to secure some sort of deal to get this case resolved, get the Canadians home. And the original impetus for writing the book was to these two gentlemen were languishing in two separate Chinese jails. By year two, it was a story that was beginning to fade, like many hostage crises, from the headlines. And so part of my interest in writing the book was to keep the story alive. Fortunately, it wasn't so fortunate for us, but literally as we were correcting the final pages for the book and about to send it off to the printer, we received word that Meng Wanzhou was going to be heading home, and the next morning the two Canadians arrived back on Canadian soil. A deal had been cooked up. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But it did force us to write a concluding chapter. It was a classic stop the presses moment. I think our publisher almost had a heart attack, but we had some very good contacts, so we were able to get the inside story about how a deal was finally concluded. But I think one of the sort of key puzzles in this story is, why did President Xi Jinping, the leader of China, take such a keen interest in this case? What made what we would call a fairly ordinary hostage situation involving obviously the Chinese government a matter of such high politics? And I think it's important to sort of go back to something that Mike said. First of all, Huawei had been in the sights of the Justice Department for a long time, since it began operations in the United States on Valentine's Day in 2001. There were various reasons. Theft of intellectual property, that was a big one. A second one was that a subsidiary of Huawei was breaking sanctions against Iran, or perceived to be doing so. And so, that was the origins of the extradition request against its chief operating officer, who also happened to be, by the way, the daughter of the founder of the company. And that extradition request went to Canadian authorities. And when the arrest takes place, or detention, in Vancouver Airport in November 2018, end of November 2018. It happened at the very moment the President of the United States quite literally was having dinner with other G20 leaders that included President Xi Jinping of China in Buenos Aires. And Prime Minister Trudeau was also at the dinner. From all reports, it was a wonderful dinner. The two presidents, the President of the United States and the President of China, were getting along famously. Canada, which quite frankly had had a bit of a rocky start at the beginning of the Trudeau government, trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with China that went nowhere, was now planning some 19 ministerial visits going forward to China, and everybody was having a great time down in Buenos Aires. The next morning, President Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister learned that Meng Wanzhou, Chief Operating Officer of Huawei, had been detained in Vancouver. Well, why did that matter to the Chinese? First of all, she wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was the daughter of one of the most prominent multinationals that China has. And as somebody said to me, who will remain unmentioned, it was a bit like, in Canadian terms, arresting the daughter or son of Wayne Gretzky. This was a company and its founder who had sort of rock star status in China. Secondly, it was seen as a public humiliation for the president of China on the world stage. The timing of the event, it was obviously interpreted as something that was intended to embarrass him personally. And it's pretty clear that the case stuck in his craw for a very long time and proved to be a major irritant, not just in Canada-Sino relations, but also U.S. Sino relations. I think many of the members of your audience will understand the importance of Yangtze. I'm not the Chinese speaker, but keeping face, saving face, and this was a very public, a very global humiliation of the leader of one of the great powers of the world. So that elevated what some would say, a fairly ordinary extradition case to high politics.
Absolutely. And before we go further, Mike, can I turn back to you? Tell us a little bit about who the two Michaels were. I think for a lot of people, the two Michaels it's almost like a rock band. You've heard the phrase, but who were these two people and how did they get caught up in this incident?
Right. Well, we have Michael Kovrig. He was a Canadian diplomat on leave of absence, had been on a leave of absence for about 2 years, and had joined the International Crisis Group, which I'm sure we all know what that is. He got the job on the reference of Alan Rock, who was a former Canadian ambassador, retired justice minister, and off he went to become he's a Mandarin speaker, born in Toronto, Hungarian ancestry, played in a punk rock band in the 90s when he was, finding his feet and having a good time after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and all of that, when the Eastern European capitals were opening up and springing to life. Anyway, so in 2018, he's a Mandarin-speaking researcher for the International Crisis Group. He's in Beijing. He has contributed to a couple of major reports on the ICG's broader understanding of, the North Korean, nuclear threats, China's influence in Africa. And he talks to people, he gets their points of view, he contributes. And I guess if you're looking for a narrative for someone that you want to pretend that might be a spy, going around talking to people. So that was kind of a profile that may have looked appealing, in our view anyway, from everything we could determine, that made him, a potential target for someone that the Chinese government was going to decide to arrest for spying. Michael Spavor, roughly the same age, I think a little bit younger, was living in a city called Dandong in China, which is almost, basically across a river from North Korea. And he became a Korean enthusiast. But a decade earlier, he'd set up shop in sort of this city and was sort of creating a transit travel company, brokerage, fixer firm to get people into North Korea. He loved North Korea. He loved the people. He loved the fact that he got to see North Korea. His big sort of moments. He had an incredible moment in the public spotlight that sort of went unnoticed at the time, or his role in it. It was when Dennis Rodman, the crazy tattooed basketball player who appeared as a contestant on Donald Trump's Apprentice TV show, you may recall, went to North Korea and became friends with the North Korean leader. And the fixer that made this happen was Michael Spavor. He speaks fluent Korean. He knew how to connect people. He made the trip. He did the work, the legwork. He got to hang out and have cocktails on Kim Jong-un's yacht and posted it on Instagram and thought, wow, is this ever cool? So when Meng Wanzhou was arrested on December 1st, 2018, I was working as a reporter at the Canadian Press then, as I am now, and obviously it was a big deal. And then those intervening days between their arrests 9 days later, on or around December 10th, we only found out about those on that day and then subsequent days. There were lots of warnings in between that, the Chinese will retaliate. There will be tit for tat. And these two men became a part of that, basically part of that negotiation, part of that transaction. You took one of ours, we take two of yours. And it was meant to put pressure on Canada, on the Canadian government, to say, listen, don't stop being the lapdog of the United States. This is a bogus prosecution. These guys are spies. This is legitimate. And in the sort of course of reporting the story and then eventually joining with Fenn to write a book about it and pull it all together, asked numerous times, had numerous contacts with Chinese, basically through the Chinese embassy, to say, okay, well, what's the case? What's the case against them? What have you got? Like, show us the charge sheet. When Meng Wanzhou made her way to the Vancouver courts and her extradition hearing started, it became a trial within a trial, which volumes and volumes of evidence was presented. There was, at one point, just a deathly boring silent video of 14 minutes of her being sort of arrested and waiting around by customs agents. Just hard drives worth of documents filed, and eventually, almost 3 years of court proceedings to determine whether or not she should be extradited. Whereas the Michaels, there was a vague one-page charge sheet that said you're spies. There were two closed trials. Eventually, they were convicted. No one was allowed in to watch the trials. We've heard bits and pieces of what we think the evidence was against them. And so basically, there was a couple of relatively young Canadian men who lived interesting lives, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That if you wanted to, create a narrative that said, these guys might be spies, that's basically, how they found themselves in this situation. And it could have, and as many people, the point was made, and many people have made it, it could have been anybody. It could have been any number of my journalistic colleagues working in that country at that time. And now they're out. And as Fenn alluded to a moment ago, I think part of the reason for writing this book is we wanted to tie the threads of all of this together. And I don't think either one of us expected that they would get out by the time any book was published. But we thought that if a book did land, it might make a small little thud and have people at least talk about this and have some new ideas and see where this would go.
Thanks very much for that. And for those of you who are watching this live, you can use the Q&A box on the webinar function that you have there to send us questions that you might like to ask for Mike Blanchfield and Fen Hampson. Fen, let me come to you on someone who is not a household name in the United States, but is certainly well known in Canada, and that is Alan Rock. His role, beginning at the beginning, having been a bit of a mentor for Michael Kovrig, but throughout this episode, and particularly in the later moments, can you talk a little bit about why he was so important in this story?
Well, there are actually two very prominent Canadians who became engaged in this case. And it really was to look at the Canadian government's legal options, given the what was widely seen as the politicization of an extradition case by the then President of the United States, who, publicly said he was prepared to use Meng as a bargaining chip in trade talks with China. And I think it's also fair to say there were concerns on the Canadian side because normally when a company is in violation of U.S. laws or a subsidiary of a company, it's the company that Justice Department officials go after, not individuals. So the personalization of the case, I think, raised some questions. But Alan Rock did have a personal connection, as did more indirectly Louise Arbour, former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, who had left that position to become head of the International Crisis Group. She wasn't actually there, I believe, when Michael Kovrig was hired, but she certainly, knew of him. And they became engaged through entreaties that were made by Vina Najibullah, the wife of Michael Kovrig, who was, trying to keep their plight in the news, and also looking at, were there ways to sort of short circuit. It wasn't a trial, by the way. It was an extradition hearing before a justice of the British Columbia Court. And, it was a legal process that could have literally gone on for years, because she and her lawyers were challenging the extradition request of the United States, on grounds that this was sort of a quite literally trumped up set of charges against her and Huawei. And so I think the fear of many was that, one, highly politicized case. That's not normally the case. In extradition, it's petty criminals who've done something bad in the U.S. or on the other side of the border, and that's why you have extradition treaties, so they can be deported. So that was one, and the second was, was there a way, for the government of Canada, in particular, the Minister of Justice, to intervene in the case? And so she turned to Alan Rock, Louise Arbour, to really, do a close scrub, shall we say, of Canada's extradition laws. And they came to the conclusion that it was well within the power, and in fact, it's in the extradition treaty itself, for the Minister of Justice to intervene at any point prior to the court rendering a decision, in an extradition hearing, on whatever grounds they feel are appropriate. And so, there was a lot of discussion, in Ottawa about whether the government of Canada should, because the Minister of Justice wouldn't act on his own in this case, could intervene and sort of short circuit the whole process. And people said, they got up on their soapboxes and said, well, the rule of law, we've got to hand her over to the Americans. We have to see this process through. And others said, well, you don't really understand the rule of law because, you're at a T-junction here and you can go one way or you can go the other way, and it's legally within the authority of the government to do so. Ultimately, which choice you make is a political one. And I think there was a lot of concern in Ottawa that if the government, through the Attorney General, had intervened and said, okay, Madam Meng, we're ending this on the grounds that this doesn't really pass the smell test. It's become a politicized case as a result of the words and actions of the President of the United States. You can go home. And the Chinese had pretty much signaled very early on that if that happened, then they would let the two Michaels go free. I mean, they knew what the game was quite clearly. And in fact, the Chinese ambassador had said that directly and privately to Mike Blanchfield in one of his interviews. So if you read the tea leaves carefully. But I think the real concern was, having just concluded a very difficult free trade set of negotiations to a rearguard action to keep NAFTA alive through CUSMA. We call it CUSMA, the Canada-U.S. Mexican Agreement. In the United States, it's USMCA or something like that. Canada comes at the end. But, with a volatile, erratic president, nobody wanted to do anything that was going to lead to some kind of retaliation. So, that was the Canadian calculation. And at the same time, the Canadian government wanted to keep its head low when it came to the Chinese, not to say anything too terribly provocative, because we were exporting, quite a bit of agricultural commodities to China. They did actually go after some of that beef and canola exports that they suspended for a period. But that's really, a very long answer to your question. There was a personal connection, and it was really triggered by the wife of Michael Kovrig, who was, looking for a legal way to bring these guys home and, short circuit the extradition process.
Thank you for that. Just a reminder, if you're watching this live, you can use the Q&A box to send a question into our panelists. But we have a question from one of our students, Joshua Baker. Over to you, Josh.
Oh, I guess my big question for either one of you, where does Canada go from here after this dispute with between China and the United States? As you know, Canada is a middle power, and there's other middle powers out there that are allies with the United States, but also have economic trade ties with China and the United States. At school, in our U.S. China studies classes, we're learning that, the United States should try and not make a nation like a middle power choose between working with the United States or China, because it'll just get very messy dealing with both if it's the hostilities or existing between both countries. So as a middle power for Canada, where do we go from here, and what do other middle powers like Canada, what should they take away from this going forward in potential U.S.-China disputes? Thank you.
Well, I think what we've seen since then, and I've reported it on this after the book, is they're going literally to Taiwan. They're going to the ASEAN countries. They're going wherever they can find to make other trade deals in Asia. They've opened up formal trade negotiations with India again. That's been on and off for years. And part of this is just it's a concerted effort to be less independent, less economically dependent on China. And the pandemic obviously brought that home with the supply chain issues and over-reliance on, personal protective equipment and, all the stuff that we were relying to get out of China that we couldn't get. So that's on a pure economic level, that's where it's going. And there's a concerted effort to do that. And the fact that Canada publicly announced it was in trade talks with Taiwan after the Michaels came back says something, because there was a lot of frustration at the time with not wanting to do something to basically get these guys thrown into a worse jail cell than they were already in, feeling that, yes, there was one pathway through using, a certain section of the rule of law to say, sure, we can intervene. But on the other hand, there was a very strong sense in the government of the day that, well, we're not changing our rules for these guys. And that maybe, the rule of law, we owe it to the United States, whether we like this president or not. We have a treaty and we have to respect that, and we can't mess with that. It had never been done before. That's not to say it couldn't have been done a first time, but that was clearly the landscape they were in. There was a lot of frustration on the fact of the government. Even while the Michaels were in prison, they still joined other international, movements towards condemning the Uyghur atrocities, condemning the clampdown in Hong Kong, condemning, actually advocating for Taiwan to have a higher standing in the World Health Organization during talks on COVID-19. So they were doing this anyway, but they were trying to be respectful and trying to do everything they could to get the Michaels out, hold the line on how they perceive the best way forward on the rule of law, even though there was immense pressure from the families to say, do something, use whatever loophole you can do to get them out. What has changed now is the rhetoric is very cold between Canada and China, and the Canadian government is now working on its own Indo-Pacific policy, which the Americans have, which is basically, shorthand for how do we deal with everyone in Asia other than the Chinese, and how do we deal with the Chinese elephant of Asia. Government is nowhere near getting it done. The Ukraine conflict kind of threw the work off a bit, and that's where that is. But there is definitely a change in sort of, Canada's approach to, this is, we can't ignore China, but we're looking elsewhere, and we're not afraid to poke it in the eye, in little, middle, small power ways, and saying, by the way, we're talking to Taiwan that you may invade tomorrow.
I think before, if I could jump in, before the case, this case erupted, the Canadian policy, I would characterize it, for those of you who are IR scholars, as much more of a hedging policy vis-a-vis China and the United States, in the sense that, Canada and the Trudeau government in particular was keen to diversify its trade relations, reduce dependence on the United States. China's obviously a very big market for that. They have an insatiable appetite for a lot of the things that Canada is known for: energy, agricultural goods, etc. And that was reflected on two fronts. One, the initiation of free trade talks with the Chinese. As I said, they went nowhere because Canada went with its progressive trade agenda, and the Chinese just threw it back at us. And that could have been predicted. But secondly, Huawei, while the United States was sort of pulling up the drawbridge, Canada was rolling up the red carpet to welcome Huawei into Canada. Huawei, seeing the writing on the wall in the United States, was making major investments in Canada. They'd set up a major research park. They were working with some of our big telcos, putting in 3G, 4G networks. Some had signed contracts for 5G from Huawei to use its gear for our switch to, or move to 5G networks. And the government was not following suit with the United States and its other Five Eyes partners, which were essentially saying, we're not going to do business with this company for all kinds of security reasons. And so Canada was kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too. The government, by the way, has still not made a decision on Huawei's future in Canada. That has been pending now for the better part of, 4 years, Michael? And so, but I think during this whole crisis, it went from hedging to hunkering down, if I can put it in those terms. Just, trying to not rankle the Chinese. I mean, when Parliament passed a vote on the Uyghurs, condemning China for atrocities, the cabinet was noticeably absent from that debate in Parliament and did not endorse, the government did not endorse that resolution. So, they were playing it very carefully. Now I think they're prepared to be a bit more aggressive.
Just a quick addition on sort of the future of Huawei in Canada. Yes, Canada is the only one of the Five Eyes countries to slam the door shut, but and the government dragged its heels forever on this because they couldn't make this decision while these two guys were locked up.
Yeah.
But the market has effectively made the decision for them, and I think it's allowed the government to do nothing, which you can argue the merits of that, but Huawei's basically pulled up stakes in Canada. Their equipment is being stripped out of the 5G networks. The upgrades, they basically sold 4G equipment that could be upgraded, like upgrading your operating system. I mean, it had that capability. There was also nuts and bolts in there, and that stuff is being stripped away. Virtually every Chinese national employee of Huawei has absconded and gone back home. They were on that plane when Meng left, or soon after. So there's basically a shell of the corporation here left, and they have literally zero ambition or hope that they'll ever really be doing meaningful business on 5G. It does beg the question why, the government should just make a policy announcement on it. On the other hand, maybe, who knows, maybe it's a calculation of cabinet, and we'll never know, for another 20 years that maybe they've decided. The market has decided these guys have been shredded. We don't even need to deal with this, and let's move on, and let's publicize our trade talks with Taiwan and Thailand and Indonesia and India and get on with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, gentlemen, for the answer. We have another question now from Peter Huang, who is a Canadian third-year student at our Hopkins campus in Homewood, studying international studies and economics. His question is that he's been following this case very closely, and one point of discussion that came up, at least in the media coverage, was that Prime Minister Trudeau's scandal related to SNC-Lavalin played a factor in preventing the Minister of Justice from intervening or put Canada on the back foot. Can you talk a little bit about what that was all about, and then what extent it may have played, if any, in this particular episode? I don't know which of you might want to grab that first.
I'll take that on. All
right, please.
So the scandal, if I can use that term earlier, and it led to the resignation of Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was our Minister of Justice at the time, was one of our big firms had been accused of corruption. SNC-Lavalin, it's a major global player in the construction engineering business. And the government came under pressure from representatives of that company to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement that will be familiar to most Americans, because American companies seem to negotiate these like bubble gum out of a candy machine with the Department of Justice when they run into trouble. And the Minister of Justice, who wears two hats, Attorney General of Canada and Minister of Justice, came under pressure to agree to a DPA while the matter was still under consideration, while the case was still under consideration by the Department of Justice. The short, not to get into too much detail, but she resisted that pressure that came, from senior officials, from the company itself, and from the Prime Minister's office to intervene in the case. Said, this is the rule of law. It's not my business to tell the public prosecutor, I guess it is, how to do their business. She ended up resigning in a very public way. She's written a book about it. And so when some Canadians, including Messrs. Mr. Alan Rock and Louise Arbour, argued initially privately, but then publicly, that the government should have intervened in this case. Some felt, well, this would be seen as a political interference in a judicial matter. It's just like an SNC-Lavalin, but in truth it was actually quite different, a very different situation, because under Canada's extradition laws, as I explained earlier, the Minister of Justice does have the authority to intervene. I don't think that was the only consideration. Trudeau earlier had been faced with a hostage crisis in the Philippines, 2 Canadians who'd been kidnapped along with some other foreign nationals. Trudeau refused to negotiate. So other countries, Western countries, did negotiate. Their nationals were released. The 2 Canadians were killed. They literally lost their heads. And so some felt that, Trudeau didn't want to sort of change his precedent when it came to hostage negotiations. Now, again, Donald Trump, before he was elected, said he would never engage in hostage diplomacy, which he accused the Obama administration of doing with Iran, Americans who had been, detained in Iran. Well, he negotiated some 40 hostage deals, if not more. This happens all the time. Canada had done it earlier when a very prominent Canadian was kidnapped in, was it Chad or one of those countries in Western Africa. Trudeau was sort of, holding firm. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't know what went through the Prime Minister's head, but it was probably a variety of considerations there.
Yeah, the interesting element, other interesting element of the dynamic that you raise in your question is it played a role in how the Americans handled this after Trump was defeated and the Biden administration came, because Joe Biden was faced with the same dynamic that the Trudeau government was on a much smaller scale with this one particular company, which was a big Canadian company, which was that Donald Trump had, as everybody knows, had turned his Justice Department into his private partisan law firm. And obviously Joe Biden wanted to undo the damage of his predecessor and restore faith in institutions. One of them was the Department of Justice. So there was a reluctance early on to plus he had the Biden administration had a pandemic to fight and all kinds of other matters, but they were not open to entreaties, in the first February 23rd, 2021 meeting between Trudeau and Biden, which was the traditional Canada-U.S. bilateral meeting after the new U.S. president is sworn in. It was virtual, but I was actually literally in the Prime Minister's office when it happened, and watched the exchanges and watched the body language. Watched Joe Biden on a gigantic screen hovering over Justin Trudeau, and Biden very conspicuously mentioned the 2 Michaels. He called them bartering chips. Said this was wrong, and he was going to work with Canada, to see what the United States could do. This took 8 months, and part of the reason was that the Americans had to come around to the realization that this just had to be done, and this wasn't the same thing as Donald Trump trying to get his attorney general to overturn votes and pressure states and do whatever carpetbagging, corrupt, law-breaking, maneuvers that probably led to a lot of resignations in Washington in that department during that administration.
Well, the issue, Mike, was the deferred prosecution agreement negotiations had started under Trump. They'd gone nowhere. And, Canadians were hoping for a, sort of quick resolution of that, because if an agreement could be reached, then Canada would release Meng Wanzhou if an agreement was reached with U.S. Department of Justice officials. And then, she could fly home, and then hopefully the two Michaels could then fly back to Canada. That was kind of the issue. And as Mike said, Biden was not prepared to intervene in any way. He let the Justice Department run its course, and they ended up successfully negotiating an agreement. Sorry, Mike, just to make that clear for our audience.
Well, what they did was, under the dynamic of that, they decided, well, let's take a second look at this and let's see if this is really worthwhile. And so there was, the Justice Department did that. They wanted to make this go away. And then there was a fateful phone call between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in early September, in which they talked about a lot of, the irritants in the U.S. China relationship, upcoming summits that were going to happen. And by that point, there was negotiations going on, and behind the scenes pushes by Canadian officials. The Canadian ambassador to China spent actually several weeks in Washington working with the Canadian ambassador to Washington, Huawei executives, trying to get them to say, hey, Huawei, this is how it's done in the United States. It's okay. We can do an agreement. You won't lose face. Your executive will get to go home. And one thing to keep in mind about all of this, there was never, ever a guarantee that China would do a quid pro quo. I mean, it was never really explicitly said by the Chinese government that they would let these two guys go. They maintained with a poker face that, oh no, these two guys are spies, and this is separate. But let our unjustly imprisoned Chinese executive go, who is a victim of your unjust Canadian justice system because you are the lapdogs of the United States and you don't have a spine. And the other interesting point about this whole deferred prosecution agreement and this line of legal pathway in Canada's extradition law is, the most significant thing is the Chinese knew it inside out. They knew that it was clause 23.3. And when Alan Rock was sitting across the table from these Chinese officials, when he eventually did make it to China with a team of eminent Canadians to say, let's see what we can do, they hit him with the gotcha. They said, no, you do have the means. They had done their research, and Rock admitted that and knew it was there, and
it's in the book. It's in the book. So
it's in the book. It's all laid out.
It's in the book, and at the end of the day, it really was a classic Cold War hostage swap. Chris and members of the audience. There was a lot of that during the Cold War, and this was probably, to come back to something you said earlier, Chris, this was probably the first major sort of Cold War hostage swap involving unwitting Canadians and a prominent Chinese official in a three-way negotiation that ended it. And fortunately, it's a story that does have a happy ending. So I see we're at the end of the hour, and that may be a good place to end.
Oh no, we get you till 1:15. So
okay. So
I know.
I've
had students pull that on me before, but I've got you. Let me ask a question. There's a chapter in the book which I quite enjoyed because I thought it was, for me, a little bit of a wake-up call, which was a chapter you call A Brief History of Underestimating China. Now, how do you think, going into this, that Canada underestimated China and to some extent Washington underestimated China in this particular episode?
Well, I think the Trump administration underestimated China because Donald Trump thought he could steamroll his way over anybody, shred the rule book, get some leverage, play hardball, which he did, and some may argue that he did get some gains. In terms of Canada, I mean, that chapter is based on some cabinet documents that that I got from the Mulroney and Chrétien eras that show that this whole repeat pattern of let's engage with China because we have to. Let's get some. We lost Fen there. What happened?
Hopefully, you'll be with us shortly.
Yeah. Let's do. And then kind of getting the Chinese pulling a fast one, let's say, and it's outlined with under the Chrétien era. Canada wanted China to take part in these dialogues and justice and other things, and ministerial forums, and China finally said, yeah, okay, we'll do it, but we want you to abstain in a vote at the Human Rights Council, and Canada did. And anyway, and then the Trudeau, the new Trudeau government came in, and they had the benefit of this information. They even had an intelligence, or not an intelligence, but a diplomatic note written by Michael Kovrig himself, and he was a diplomat in Beijing, covering the trial of a dissident, and noting the repression and the crackdown, and human rights audits within the foreign affairs departments, showing various things. Anyway, and it was it just created this pattern that sort of I told you so, and then don't underestimate what China could do and what China might be willing to do to pursue its interest. And I guess as we talked at great length, that line got crossed when a person basically was considered business royalty got arrested, and that was when the underestimation, I think, really sort of came home. But a lot of that information is it's a new sort of bit of sort of documentary evidence of sort of the evidence of sort of the engagement of successive Canadian governments over time, and sort of a pattern seemed to emerge, at least in our minds, when we were putting the book together.
Mm-hmm. And while we're hoping to get Fen back, I'm going to turn to you for sort of another question building on that. Do you think that going forward, Canada, and to some extent the United States, have some takeaways from this episode? What kind of lessons can be learned from this, other than the fact that it was a pretty miserable performance in many ways by the United States, by China, arguably, and even by Ottawa? There was a lot of mistakes made, but going forward, what are the takeaways you think might be most useful for not just for governments, but for our students as they move into positions of responsibility in their careers?
Another element of the book we haven't discussed is, there are real lives, real people at stake. And if you read the book, you read about, obviously we didn't interview the two Michaels because they were in prison, and it was good that they got out, obviously. But these are real lives at stake, and other people that we interviewed, such as Robert Fowler and other diplomats, and Alan Rock, who was a former ambassador. When you hear about consular cases and people in trouble, these are exceptional circumstances of exceptional trouble. But it's human beings and it's human lives, and it's something never to lose sight of if you're working in diplomacy, if you're working in foreign countries, and also just everybody's a target. Lots of diplomats have said that. Diplomats in our book have said that, and I don't honestly know how you navigate that, but there are systems in place, and hopefully that can be done.
And now I may have to turn to you for a final question if we don't get Fen back, because I'd be interested in seeing what he thinks of this. But for Canada-U.S. relations, Canadians have dealt with the United States for a long time. To what extent does this episode taint future relations with the United States, with the Biden administration and future governments? Was there an element of trust that changed throughout this episode? Oh, I have you muted, unfortunately. There you are.
I think in some ways the trust got restored because the Americans on whom Canada really were relying to find one pathway out of this really had to, come through. And I think on this particular aspect, I think there is alignment. And I know that the U.S. government wants to see a Canada, China, or Indo-Pacific policy, because I think the United States feels they're more alone in the world in certain ways than they used to be. They can't do it alone. They need allies. They need, a small country like Canada. There's no two As it was put to me by one official, that there's no country that's too small to be our friend, to help us, to join us, to stand up for these values and our interests. And there is this shared experience, obviously, and it seems to have some value in Washington. You can argue on a whole bunch of other levels that Canada continues to be ignored or forgotten or whatever, and that's to be discussed in another forum. But anyway, I think it was in rough shape under the Trump administration, and it did get better. And the United States wants people on its side as it tries to engage with this, other economic superpower that can't be ignored.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. And for our viewers, the book we've been talking about is this one, The Two Michaels by Mike Blanchfield and Fen Hampson. I'm struck by your answer just now because the book has a blurb on it on the back and also on the front cover from the recently deceased Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State. And it reminds me that there was throughout this period, at least in sort of the Washington foreign policy community, a remarkable awareness of this case and the details of this case. Some of that cut through to ordinary Americans, but for a certain generation of diplomats, for a certain generation of American leadership, this case really had resonance. It really got people's attention. And I hope that our rising students will take this case particularly seriously and try not to let the lessons that you really, both you and Fen did a beautiful job pulling out in this book, take them to heart and try to do better next time. We're not perfect. We all can improve. To give you one last, can I ask you, how are the Michaels doing now that they've come home to Canada? How are they? I mean, obviously it's hard to recover from an experience like this, but if you have any sense, how are they?
Michael Spavor asked for basically privacy the week after he got out. His family put out a statement through Canada's foreign ministry, the photo of him and a very large dog looking very happy. He's rebuilding his life because he lost everything, right? He's built a life in a consultancy and a business in China. He lost everything. While he was in prison, his family and his supporters did a GoFundMe page and raised, I think their goal was to raise something like 45,000 Canadian dollars. I think they've exceeded it. I haven't checked lately. It's basically, a rebuilding your career fund for a guy in his 40s who has to start over. So he's below. That's literally everything we know there. Michael Kovrig has he seems to be relatively active on social media, not hugely, but he's seen at the Halifax Security Forum, which is a Canadian think tank, foreign policy think tank event that happens every year. That was last fall, shortly after he got out. And as far as we know, he's living somewhere in Canada, keeping a very low profile, not giving interviews. Haven't seen him weigh in on anything. Haven't seen him post anything, related to, say, the Olympics or whatever. But I mean, we interview Robert Fowler in the book, who was taken hostage by Al Qaeda in West Africa a decade earlier. We interviewed him to get the benefit of his experience as a hostage. He's a former diplomat, and he said, it just takes time. You have to be left alone. You have to spend time with the people you love, and we assume that's what they're doing. I expect that they'll both write books or come out and tell their story because they've got a story, their own story to tell, and what it meant to them and their families. And I'll be the first one to want to read it.
Well, I will as well. I think for on behalf of all of us at Johns Hopkins, I really want to thank you, Mike Blanchfield and Fen Hampson, for telling this story, for telling it so well and so quickly. I know you had to do a stop the presses moment to make sure you included their return, but this is an episode that has human drama, high politics, and even some low politics, unfortunately. But it's a fascinating case study, one that I think gives us a lot to think about as we move forward into a new era of what may be U.S. China rivalry, or may just be the rise of China, the growing role of the United States. However we go forward, I think you've given us a lot to work with. And I really want to thank you for the book. Thank you also, our audience, students, and others who've taken a chance to hear a bit about the book. You can buy it. It's available on Amazon, even in the United States, available at all good bookstores. The Two Michaels from Sutherland House Press. My name is Christopher Sands, and on behalf of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins and the China Research Center at Johns Hopkins, thank you for your time, and we hope we'll have you back here virtually, if not in person, very soon.